Hello, everyone, and welcome to our fifth lecture in leadership and organizational behavior. Today, we will be talking about the leadership potential in people and how that relates to organizational success. So we will be covering two very interlinked topics. We will be talking about the definition of a leader, as well as leadership traits and how ethics factors in this topic, generally speaking. So I think that by today we will be briefly also covering some topics that we have discussed earlier, because when we talk about leadership, we talk about people skills. And when we talk about people skills, there is no way that we can avoid talking, for example, about attitudes and about personality types, and which of these is befitting when it comes to, say, the way that people behave with one another. Great. So the first part of the lecture, we will be talking, or we will be describing, what are the 5 key elements of leadership. So by doing that, we will also be understanding what are the 10 main managerial roles in an organization. And you might remember this because we talked about Mintzberg roles. It is basically the same thing, but we will be discussing it, and we will see how that factors into the traits that a leader should possess. Then we will try and understand, as well as analyze, what is the interrelation between various levels of leadership, before continuing to understand what are the main behavioral leadership theories, if at least there is some theoretical framework that can predict what is considered within the frameworks of leadership potential. And finally, we will try to understand trait and behavioral leadership theories, as well as contingency theories that pertain to leadership. In the second part of the lecture, we will be focusing on the traits that makes a leader a leader. So basically, we will try to classify what traits are largely prevalent into leadership individuals, into leaders, because we will find out that there is no uniform measurement of what traits a leader should possess. So on top of that, we will still describe what are the big 5 personality dimensions. Again, a topic that we have covered in detail in the last lectures. But again, now we want to understand how this big 5 personality that we have understood so well in the last lecture, how that relates to how a leader must behave, or to how the organization dynamics responds when it comes to leadership traits. So by then, we will try to explain the universality of leaders' traits, as well as to understand what is the importance of these traits of dominance that we will be visiting soon. Then we will try to distinguish between the achievement motivation theory and what is the leader's profile. So this is something that is probably the most prominent way to identify what are the core profile, or what are the core traits that makes a leader, and we will try to distinguish between theory X, Y, and the Pygmalion effect. Again, we will be revisiting this topic again that we have discussed last week, but it will be into another perspective. Then we will describe how attitudes are used to develop the 4 leadership styles and attitudes. And finally, we will try to explain the stakeholder approach to ethics. Great. So initially, we want to understand what a leader is, and probably the more people there are in a discussion, the more definitions of a leader we might find. A leader is somebody that we think when we, for example, take into account some powerful individual, some dynamic individual, a very outgoing or even timid individual, but one that has commanded, for example, armies to great victories in the past, or have helped probably to create some nation, or to start a new religion, for example, or even to direct corporate empires. So leadership in itself is the influencing process of leaders and followers to achieve organizational objectives through change. So as you can see, we are talking about a process that is two ways in itself. So it is not only the leaders that will influence their followers, but it is something that goes both ways. And we will discuss this in depth in just a bit. So again, when we think of leaders, for example, we might think of people such as, for example, Julius Caesar, and the way that he formed or shaped the greatness of the Roman Empire, or Nelson Mandela, for example, or Mahatma Gandhi, or Mother Teresa, for that matter. So we might have in ourselves groups of different people that probably share a completely different personality traits, but that are considered leaders nonetheless. On the other hand, we might have corporate giant leaders such as Bill Gates or Steve Jobs, the late Steve Jobs of Apple, whose traits we still consider as being leadership material, though they differ in form and function to those that we discussed earlier. So to those that belong to, say, Mahatma Gandhi or Nelson Mandela. And on the other hand, few people will call upon the leadership skills of, for example, Adolf Hitler when we talk about leadership, because the road or the use that his leadership potential has taken is unethical in nature, and we will be discussing about that when we talk about the ethics and how it relates to our leadership potential in itself. But in one view, leadership is when we gain followers because we tend to use our internal as well as learned personality criteria to in order to influence other people as well. Okay, so we have also to note that there is no universal definition of leadership, because in itself leadership is a very complex topic to be discussed, and usually it is studied in different views. So we have mentioned leaders that belong to a political landscape or a spiritual landscape or even corporate landscape. So basically the traits that needed to be covered, or the definition that needs to be covered for each of these different types of leaders varies in definition as well. So we tend to bring together the concept of followers, or the reason why followers follow leaders, as probably the common attribute that all leaders have. But the definition itself is something that cannot be generalized under a universal definition. But on the other hand, when we try to define a leader, we might come together to some common grounds, and that is when we mention what are the key elements of leadership. And when we discuss the key elements of leadership, we tend to analyze these 5 key elements. So we have leaders and followers, which in fact try to define what is the relationship that exists between a leader and a follower. So the people in charge and the one that are receiving or on the receiving end of the orders. Then we will be having also what the influence is. So in fact, this element means that how leaders try to influence followers. Then we have organizational objectives, which means how leaders help to use their influence for good, in the sense how to help the organization to reach its objectives. We have people as part of the leadership definition, because this interpersonal and people management skills are critical, are very important when it comes to building trusted relationship, as we have mentioned times and times over. And finally, we have the concept of change, because leaders are the ones that have the entrepreneurial blood in themselves. So it is expected from leaders to transform the workplace and the organizations. They are the pioneers and the ones that tend to seek outside of the box. So in the following slides, we will try to cover each of these elements of leadership in turn. Initially, we will go and cover the topic of leaders and followers as one of the key elements of leadership. So in this sense, we have the correlation between a leader and a follower goes, as we said, both ways. So just as much as a leader tries to influence followers, so do the followers influence leaders themselves, be it by vocally disagreeing or debating, or by being a role model or a providing different and more or better approaches to certain decision. So in a sense, even though we tend to differentiate a manager and a leader, in a sense, because the manager is basically a person who has a formal title and related authority to deal or to give orders within an organization, a leader is not necessarily a person who has that formal power. A leader can come even from subordinates or from simple employees who has the traits or the energy or some combined personality traits that makes a leader a leader. So even though it is expected from a manager to be a leader can come from everywhere. So it can be either a manager or a non-manager. So in this sense, we can mainly split employees within an organization into managers and or into leaders and into followers. In this sense, the manager and the leader, the definition is what we already covered. But when it comes to the follower in itself, it is claimed that followers are usually people that are neither managers, so are the ones that are neither managers nor do they have the authority to issue orders. But that means that this person is ones that are influenced by leaders and of course follow the rules or the orders from above the hierarchy where they belong. But in itself, being a follower does not mean to be a robot, to be a yes man who agrees to everything. So followers especially in our today's organic organizations, they tend to give inputs and feedback to leaders as well. And when it comes to certain decisions that involve their expertise, they are usually consulted or even have participated in the decision-making process. So, as we said, leadership is part of a manager's work. So it is expected from managers to be involved into leadership or the leadership to take the majority of the traits that are needed to deliver their everyday duties. It also should be noted that the opinion of the followers sometimes can make a leader out of them, but a follower should be considered as the one that doesn't have the capacity to lead, but as the one who chooses so to do because of certain traits that he possesses. So there is no positive or negative ends of spectrum when we speak about leaders or followers. Both are an integral and a very important parts of or cogs in the machines that is the organization. Then when we talk about influence as one of the key elements of leadership, we are talking about the process. So influencing basically is the process when leaders try to communicate ideas to the others and then seek to gain acceptance for these ideas. And then try to motivate followers to support and implement these ideas. And ultimately, this means that they are the ones that are leading change. So as you can see, the concept here does not mean that the leader is sorry, an autocratic figure or the one who seeks to exert their own opinions to the followers. It's basically a process when a leader is the one who tries to communicate the ideas that he has, probably for the betterment of the institutions, or how certain tasks can benefit both the organization as well as the employees themselves. So by communicating ideas, he is asking for feedbacks. He is trying to gain the feedback of the followers as well in order to gain acceptance for these ideas. Only by gaining acceptance for these ideas, a leader has the legitimacy to work and to further the idea into action. So it is not enough to only be able to or to have the authority to order people what to do, but it is to kind of get people together behind the idea and see the common values or the shared values into the idea so that everybody can be motivated enough to work in peak capacity or peak performance. And by motivating followers to support and implement ideas, they can easily go about the most difficult issue that an organization faces, especially when it deals with its human resources, that is to lead change, something that we discussed a lot in our previous lectures, and we will be covering, or we will be dedicating an entire lecture to change by the end of the semester. So, I'm sorry. Having a managerial position in itself makes the leader process probably a little easier because it also gives the power to the people so they can influence others. Usually managers are the ones that employees look up to, even if they tend not to have, or not necessarily, they tend to have all the characteristics that are required of them as leaders. But the ability to influence people is something that can be developed. So there is a certain school of thought that thinks that leadership is born and not made, but there is certain potential into developing influencing skills that are probably one of the most important characteristics of a leader in a practical perspective. So we can learn the ways of power or how power works. We can use politics and negotiating in order to lead people and administer change itself. So influencing is about, again, a relationship that exists between leaders and followers. So it requires all the three things that we said we can improve over time. So it's power, politics, and negotiation skills. And usually, when it comes to the difference or the critical difference that exists between managers and leaders in action, is that managers will try to coerce subordinates to influence their behavior because they have that authoritative power. They will use this power to push ideas instead of to push orders instead of discussing ideas with employees. So that does not mean that we are influencing them, because that is coercion. Whereas on the other hand, when we talk about influence as a key element of leadership, we're talking what leaders do. So they try to gain commitment of and enthusiasm of the people by making them part of the team, making them part of the decision-making process, and creating shared values when it comes to decisions and to the work that they will be involved in. So in this case, an effective manager in itself should know that there is a time for leading, but also a time for following, because there are some decisions that need to be taken into groups, and there are some decisions that probably are better to be taken by a popular vote. But that does not mean that we are dispersing or delegating the decision-making authority completely to the people or to the employees. It is just a matter of gaining the perspectives of various people and using that into creating a better or more informed decision, even though we understand that no matter how much information we get, we can never have sufficient information to make a perfect decision or an optimal decision, as we mentioned last week. Another key element of leadership is something that is involved into organizational objectives. When we talk about organizational objectives, it is the exact same things that leaders are trying to influence employees with. It is the concept of shared vision that we said. So when people or when employees are united into the same under the same goals. So in this sense, a leader tries to merge the personal interests of the followers. When we talk about organizational landscape, we obviously talk about the personal interests of employees, and we do that by understanding what motivates them, and we try to tackle those specific concepts, and we try to merge these personal interests of followers with those of the organization themselves, and we do that using this shared vision. And in itself, we ought to understand that leaders need to provide a direction, but the group is the ones who should provide the goals. So by being a team player, we can come about to better and more informed decisions, and ones that involve the people, which means that the level of engagement and commitment will be much higher, as would be the enthusiasm of people as well. So in this sense, we are saying that followers ought to be influenced to do ethical and beneficial tasks for the organizations as well as themselves. And that is also the direction that we're talking. So no matter who is making the decisions, the leader would be the ones who will safeguard that whatever decision that is being made or whatever goals that are being made in group decision making will be safeguarding the organizational culture, the organizational objectives, and of course, ethical considerations are to be taken to paramount importance in every decision that involves the organization itself. So leaders and followers usually tend to work together in this shared purpose by one setting an example, and leading by directing the others, and the others by setting the goals, as we already covered. Then another key element of leadership, and probably the ultimate one that a leader needs to address, is the element of change. So when we tend to influence people, and when we tend to help or to get their ideas, when we are trying to set objectives or when we try to set goals, means that we are trying to move away from what we currently have. So we are trying to adopt change to either the entire organization when it is the time to overhaul the entire organization, or when we are trying to start a new project, or when we are trying to change a new technology, or even to get into a new market. So whatever we are trying to do, we are dealing with change, because organizations nowadays are faced with a very fast-paced environment. So only by moving very fastly, by changing a lot, they can adapt to this environment. Those that do not embrace change are usually those that will go obsolete and out of the market very soon. Hence, leadership is not only about being open to change, but also to lead people through this very energy-consuming and stressful process. So, for example, we have or probably the best example that we can take of an organization that has always focused or strived to focus on the leadership traits and how this leadership can project and implement change in itself is probably General Electric, because nowadays it is, of course, we know that it is listed as one of the biggest contenders in the Dow Jones Industrial Index, but few know that it is the only company that is still active, and it is still listed in the Dow Jones Index that was also originally listed in the 1896 index when it was established. So it has been a company, and it has been a company leading the industry for more than 100 years. And they have only done that because they have embraced change, whereas when others did not. Good. So by completing the concept of change, now we know what are the key characteristics that define usually leaders in themselves. But it is not only the organizations that need change. Sometimes we ought to also consider that people themselves need to change, and that means management as well as employees themselves. When employees, for example, take chances or they induce into a proactive activity, they go beyond their job description, or they just blaze a new trail, they wander in a direction that has not been taken previously and take risks. They are the ones who add value to the organizations, because and they are usually the ones that advance through the ranks. So basically, being a proactive, being a leader, and seeking new opportunities are the traits that usually differ the successful leaders from the ordinary workers that a company has. Apart from change, we will also talk about people themselves, because we ought to understand that whenever we are talking about the organization, we are talking about an organized group of people. So if there are no people, there is no concept of change that we discussed is probably the most important element of leadership itself. So when we talk about people, we are talking about the way that interpersonal skills correlate to leadership as well. And we know as a fact that people skills or interpersonal skills are something that ought to be taken at paramount importance when it comes to defining the traits of a successful leader. So to be effective at any job nowadays in the 21st century, one must be able to get along with people. So we ought to say that nowadays people skills are more valuable than computer skills, mainly because computer skills have become more common, and there are a lot of automated processes, but you cannot automate human interaction or the way that we leave a lasting impression on employees, or how employees themselves leave a lasting impression on clients or external stakeholders of an organization, to say the least. So in this sense, people skills are crucial and are something to be valued in the job market when we are looking for managers, or we are looking for any job that require coordination. So we have to understand as well that there is a direct relationship between companies' success in general and leadership practices, because by putting value to people and treating them as assets, in fact, we are investing into something that modern management sciences calls indirect customer relationship, because by investing in people and keeping them satisfied, we are indirectly keeping even our clients satisfied, because a satisfied employee usually is an enthusiastic worker. So enthusiastic workers will in fact correlate to happy clients as well. So by enacting leadership practices into the job or the workplace, we are trying to value or overvalue the role of people in an organization, and by treating them as assets, we are improving their job efficiency in general. Because we ought to understand again that organization is basically a collaboration of people that seek to reach goals together, and by having satisfied and motivated employees, that is the way to go. So come to think of it, we will always come back to these basic questions that that have plagued these management sciences for some times. So basically, are leaders born or are they made? By made, we mean be trained or educated so they can project these leadership traits in their jobs. So we cannot basically say that an effective leader is either born or made. So obviously there are some traits, some personality traits that make it easier for people to assume leadership roles, such as, for example, being an extroverted people or somebody that has a positive self-concept of life. But surely leadership traits can be developed, and basically everybody can, if they are willing, they can become a leader. So everybody has potential of their sort to be a leader, and the other skills can be developed. So again, an argument can be made. Depends on what a leadership role we are seeking to develop and what positions are we seeking to assume. Because there are different or a completely different set of traits or personality traits that we are born into that are needed when we try to lead people, for example, to end apartheid, and it is completely different set of um, different sets of personality traits that are needed when we try to increase sales in a highly competitive global marketplace, when we belong to one of the lesser competitors, for example. So the traits are not the same. Everybody has the potential to become a leader, but an effective leader is the one that combines self or innate traits that he is born into with those that can be learned or taught during by education or by experience as well. So let us revisit what are the roles that are needed by the manager, and we will see why we are revisiting the managerial roles of Mintzberg. So basically, when we talked about the roles of the manager, we tend to claim that they fall loosely into three categories: into interpersonal, informational, and decisional roles. So basically, based on that, we said that managers need to express or exert all of these roles that belong to these three categories. So be a figurehead, a leader, a liaison, monitor, disseminator, spokesperson, or entrepreneur, disturbance handler, resource allocator, or a negotiator. So from this aspect, a manager should possess all of these skills, though they cannot use all of them at the same time, but they will use them as the opportunity or the situation uh, uh, approaches or faces itself. So again, when we talked about the figurehead role of the manager, according to Mintzberg, we tend to think of a person that is representing the company. For example, when there are some delegations that are coming, or there is some representation of the organization in legal or social or other ceremonial activities that are symbolic as well in nature. So he's the face of the organization in front of the world. And in this sense, a person has to be charismatic in order to project the organization in the best manner possible. And then we have today's topic. Obviously, he has to have the concept or the role of the leader. So it is something that is expected of managers. They have to be good leaders. And when we talk about leaders, we are talking about an expected role of the management to perform their everyday functions so they can operate the organization or the unit that they work effectively. So this means that they need to lead people and to work together towards common goals as well. So the last role of the manager, according to the interpersonal category, is the one of the liaison. So basically, as we said in the figurehead role as well, liaison would mean that the leaders are the one who serve as a contact point between the organization and the external environment. So they tend to represent the organization in meetings outside of the organization. But when it comes to the informational roles, we said that a manager can be a monitor, a disseminator, or a spokesperson. We tend to remember that when we talk about the monitor roles, the monitor is somebody who tries to gather information and to analyze how this information is translated into challenges or opportunities within an organization. He is also the disseminator, which is basically the opposite of monitor. Disseminator is when they try to give information to certain people, be that internal or external stakeholders, as well as play the role of the spokesperson, which means that they will provide information to outside of the organization itself. Then we have the four last elements or roles that the manager have, and these belong to the decisional. These belong to the decisional category of roles. That means a manager has to be an entrepreneur. And as you might recall from just what we said in the previous slides, we tended to include people that are proactive and take chances as being or having leadership potential. So when they do something that goes above and beyond the job description, even if we're talking about followers, we're talking about traits that make a leader. So entrepreneur or entrepreneurship traits are something that relate to the traits that we seek to find into leaders as well. Then we go to disturbance handler and negotiator, which is the way that leaders tend to use their interpersonal skills in order to either end a conflict or to negotiate, be that within the organization or on behalf of the organization with tasks that are outside of the normal job routine of the manager itself or the organization. So this can be a merger, an acquisition, for example, or some sort of strategic partnership, or even some other sort of dealing with trade unions or with unsatisfied employees who seek a pay rise. And then we have also the resource allocator. So a resource allocator is basically when they understand how the dynamics of the routine work works and how they tend to allocate time and resources in an appropriate fashion. So as you can see, there are some or certain roles of management that are more mechanic in nature, whereas there are some others that require people to have more proactive or energetic or to have more emotional intelligence that we've covered already in order to deal with their duties. And usually this type of jobs, say figurehead, leader, liaison, for example, a spokesperson, entrepreneur, and disturbance handler and negotiator. So more than half of the roles require that require managers that they induce or have some leadership traits in themselves. So when we understand how these 5 traits work, we are going to be using the Mintzberg roles as well as the big 5 throughout all today's lectures, and to see how that fits into the leadership traits that we intend to unravel during this lecture. We go ahead and understand that most leadership theories are formulated in terms of processes. So when we are trying to correlate how managers' role and leadership traits coincide with one another, we tend to analyze this correlation in terms of one of these 3 levels. So we either will be having the discussion into an individual level of analysis when we are seeing how leadership traits correspond to individual people, and then we have the group level of analysis, so how teams or groups or group dynamics are related to leadership traits, and then we have the overall organizational level of analysis, which deals with the functioning of the organization in general. So let's go to the individual level of analysis. So this is probably something that we will be focused more in this level of lecturing, and we will then go systematically by developing the lectures in the future towards group and organizational level of analysis when it comes to leadership. So individual level of analysis is something that deals with how people deal with tasks at an individual level. So we are seeking how individual leader or how the individual leader deals with individual followers. So how a leader deals with each of the workers or followers that he has. And that's why we call this process also as a dyadic process. So a dyadic process usually sees leadership as a process through which leaders and followers tend to influence each other simultaneously in a dynamic and ongoing process. So it is something that we covered earlier. So when we try to analyze how a leader deals with individual people, we go and assume that a leader tends to also listen to people and not only give orders to them. So in this sense, there is an implicit assumption that leadership effectiveness cannot be understood without first examining how a leader and a follower in fact influence each other. And we ought to understand also that within one organization or within even probably one business unit, there can be a lot of dyadic relationship at within the leader and employee. So basically, a leader might have specific relationship with each of the employees, as well as have other relationship with the groups or the organization in general. So this kind of targeting individuals, this interpersonal connection that a leader has with each of the employees is something that is studied within the individual level of analysis. Then we have a group level of analysis. When we talk about the group level of analysis, we talk about something that is also called as the group process. So the concept that is involved in the group level of analysis is to find out what is the relationship between a single leader or the leader and the collective group of followers. So collective group of followers or teams or groups and how a leader relates to these people. So basically, this group process usually tends to focus on the role of leaders, on cohesiveness, as well as effectiveness, and how they are dependent when it comes to leadership roles. So basically, the most appropriate or the most important way how leaders and employees tend to come together and influence one another is when meetings, for example, are organized. And they are very important in group processes because that is when a leader has the ability to talk to the group and get a general or a consolidated feeling or attitude towards certain decisions or activities that are happening within an organization. So this deals with the way that an individual, in this case the leader, is dealing with groups in general. And we will be talking about groups and teams in a dedicated lecture as well later on during the course. Then we have also organizational level of an analysis, which is also known as the organizational process. So the concept of the organizational level of analysis is to try to focus how leaders tend to lead the organization in general, how they tend to optimize performance and to see and to how they can reach change as well. So the concept is to increase or to maximize performance and also to help organization to embrace change. So in the long run, the organizational performance of the organizational performance or the role of the leaders in the organizational performance tend to focus on the concept of adapting to the environment and to get the tools and the skills in order to survive. So whether an organization will use an effective and a coherent transition process to produce its products and services and to make them relevant to the market. So these are the three levels of analysis when it comes to leadership and how it pertains to the roles of managers as well. But we also think that they do not exist in a separate dimension. So when we talk about all three, when we talk about the individual level, the group level, and the organizational level of analysis, we are talking about the same triangle or the same concept or idea. As you can see in the picture, when we are talking about the individual level of analysis, it forms the base of the triangle. So basically, if no matter what happens or no matter what the group policy or the organizational policy is when it comes to dealing with groups and people, if there is no effectiveness in dealing with individuals that are part of the company, we will be faced with lecture performance. So it might also lead to business failure. So individual level of analysis is the base. No matter how large the group or organization it is still only composed of individuals, and individuals are the ones who might be held liable for not doing the job at peak efficiency or capacity, and not the organization. So in this self, if individual performance is low throughout the organization, the triangle will fall because it will not have a firm foundation. And on the other hand, we also have a group level of analysis and the organizational level of analysis, which are as you can see, the roof of the pyramid or the roof of the triangle as well. So instead, if groups are not effective, the organizational performance will also suffer, obviously, because we're talking about certain support mechanism or support function for the organization. But also, when it comes to organizational level as a leadership trait, we're talking about the concept that organizational success usually tend to be contagious. So people tend to be highly influenced by success. So if they are working for, say, a very successful organization, they usually tend to outperform themselves. So they try to perform at their peak capacity at all times. So this will not be the case in organizations that are struggling with identity or with performance or market penetration, for example. So in this sense, we are talking about three sides probably of the same idea or the same coin, because we're talking about the base, that is the individuals, and the roof, that is the group and the organizational level of analyzing the influence a leader has in an organization. So when we try to define a leader, we tend to discuss these four main classifications, because we will see now that a leadership theory in itself cannot overgeneralize. So it cannot cover all the traits that, as we said, cover what a leader is supposed to be. So a leadership theory, as one of these four suggests, they are an explanation of some sort of or some aspect of leadership. So they might give us an idea of certain aspects of leadership, and these theories usually have practical value because they are used to understand better, predict, and control successful leadership behavior and traits. So, as usually is the case with as is usually the case with social sciences, especially during the recent years or decades, it is also the concept of how it relates to the environment, because social sciences are highly dependent on environmental variables. So we cannot say that a social theory, and especially when it comes to people related theories such as the leadership theories, they are impenetrable by changes in the environment. So in this sense, we cannot only call on theories to explain leadership, but also on paradigms, because we tend to think that theories usually shift along with a change in social paradigms as well. So a leadership paradigm, for example, in itself is a commonly accepted proclamation regarding the way that people or researchers or academicians or even professionals understand and try to evidence some traits of leadership, for example. So they have some traits, some evidence on the reasons why they are backing a certain theory. So leadership paradigm, it has changed during the last 60 years that it has been actively discussed under the modern literature. And these changes are depicted in these four leadership theoretical paradigms, starting from the trait theory paradigm, continuing with behavior leadership theory paradigm, contingency leadership theory paradigm, and lastly, or the most recent one, that is the integrative leadership theory paradigm. So we will see that these theories tend to follow a chronological order to the way that they are presented here. So it is safe to assume that the trait theory is one that has been prevalent some 60 years ago, whereas the integrative leadership theory is something that finds usage in today's world and organizational context as well. So the first one that we are going to cover is the trait theory paradigm. So when we talk about the trait theory paradigm, we tend to assume that the early leadership scholars, or the one that study scholars leadership early in the days, they tend to assume that usually leaders are born, they are not made. So basically they tend to give to explain distinctive characteristics that are related to leadership effectiveness by inducing that by claiming that there are a set of traits that all successful leaders possess. So this is something or that leadership trait theories have tried to explain and to evidence during the early 60s, so to say, so before year 1960. And they try to explain these characteristics that form leadership effectiveness. But though we tend to understand nowadays that there is no universal list of traits that all successful leaders possess, even though there have been a lot of research in this matter. So whereas we claim that Steve Jobs and Mahatma Gandhi are both leaders, we already understand that the personality traits or the leadership traits that they project are probably in most cases at the other ends of the spectrum. So researchers have tend to analyze physical and physiological traits when they tended to understand how leaders, or if there is some certain hereditary characteristic that makes leaders, and they try to understand or to analyze why certain leaders are usually related to high energy levels. If there is some certain appearance that is related to leadership potential. If you recall, when we talked about stereotyping some 2 or 3 lectures ago, we claimed that bold people tend to project more aggressiveness and certain leadership potential, even though we claim that psychologically that is just the case. But in reality, there is no relation to appearance in itself and leadership potential as well. So they tend to understand whether aggressiveness is a trait that is found in all leaders, self-reliance, persuasiveness, as well as dominant traits as well. As we will see in just a bit, there are some there is some evidence that suggests that leaders usually tend to have, for example, self-reliance when it comes to projecting or influencing others, and that might include or might be a generally acceptable trait of leaders. There is still we cannot say that there is a list as a prerequisite list when we try to categorize people as being leaders or followers in that sense. But for what it's worth, this trait theory paradigm has helped, for example, people, or has helped organizations when they were seeking to promote candidates, for example, to leadership position. So whenever a candidate was deemed to have expressed this kind of specific traits that people in the 60s thought are interrelated with leadership potential, these candidates were given leadership position. But then we found out also that this is by no means a safe method of finding leaders in people, because there is no universal trait that has been discovered as far as today. Building on the trait theory paradigm, we go ahead and understand the role of behavioral leadership theories. So now we are going into a more dynamic landscape. We have been talking in the past, so pre-1960s, pre-1950s, we have been talking about the way that traits or some certain unchangeable personality traits that might define whether we have leadership potential or not. But later on, probably because of more research that has been made, especially by the mid-50s and 60s, there has been a change into the paradigm, or a shift into the paradigm, because people came to understand that these kind of traits might not also only be internal in nature, but we have to see or to understand, in order to understand leadership, we have to see how leaders in fact behaved, not what their traits are, but how they behaved in light of various or different events or activities that they are faced during their time. So by focusing on what leaders actually did and not what they are, this is a step forward in understanding the organizational behavior dynamics and how leaders fit in within an organization. So researchers have analyzed differences in behavior of effective leaders as well as ineffective leaders, and they tend to analyze this in light of the management work, or one of the elements of the Mintzberg's roles that we discussed earlier. So by this sense, these studies have tended to come together and find how people or how leaders behave in certain situations, and by understanding or comparing and contrasting this leadership behavior, let's call it like this, we sought to understand whether there are some defining traits that leaders have. But again, we're talking about generalizing various roles of leaders across various organizations and environments. So we ought to think that, again, there is generally or no universally accepted a set of behaviors that define people in general, or leaders in general. Though researchers have sought and identified two generic dimensions of leader behavior, and that is usually leaders are either task-oriented or people-oriented, even though we tend during this lecture and our course, we tend to be reserved when it comes to claiming or strictly separating leaders into task-oriented or people-oriented, because when we claim that a leader is task-oriented, we claim to think that the main focus or the main concern of a leader is to get things done the best way as possible. So in this case, a leader seeks to motivate people to reach common goals, but the overarching objective is to get the job done. Whereas when we talk about people-oriented leadership, is when a manager or a leader is so much focused with the people that he seeks to handle conflicts a lot and to deal and to maximize job satisfaction, even though this might mean that we have to compromise a little bit on task delivery. So in these cases, we understand that either of these extremes is something that a sensible manager or a leader would do, because the concept of leadership is to get things done by getting people behind them in the sense of common values or shared values, by involving them in the decision-making process as well. Then we go on and discuss the contingency leadership, and as well, before going to our first break, we will finish contingency and integrative leadership's paradigm as well. So we will be covering the entire theoretical aspects of leadership before going on the second part of the lecture that includes leadership traits and ethics. So when we talk about the contingency leadership theory paradigm, we are talking that in a sense, we are recapping that both traits and behavioral leadership theories usually try to attempt just one best leadership style. So we are trying to understand what are the best traits or the best behavior. So even though the behavioral trait paradigm is a move forward, because we are looking at the way that people are responding to the environment, it is still both of these theories tend to find what is the best way, what is the universally accepted best way or best leadership style. And we know, and we usually tend to call these type of theories as universal theories, and either of them tend to be accurate, especially in today's conditions. So after it has become apparent that we cannot count on both of these theories to claim on certain leadership traits, the paradigm has shifted towards something that we know as contingency theory or contingency leadership theory paradigm. In itself, the contingency leadership theories try to explain the appropriate leadership style based on the leader, the followers, and the situation. So this is building up on the behavior that we discussed earlier, and we claim that a leader and even a single leader's response to the environment, so to the followers and to the situation itself, is based on various environment-related factors. So unlike the previous series, contingency theory claims that there is no universal leadership type, and we have to depend on factors such as what is the nature of the work performed, what is the external environment, and what are the characteristics of the followers that impact the way that we deal with certain activities. So the one leader that deals with the same issue into two companies might be faced with very different issues and might tackle the problem completely different, as opposed to what the previous inert theories suggested. So in other words, it seeks to understand which traits or behaviors will usually result in leadership success after we take into account these environmental variables. For example, we have some cultures that prefer autocratic leaders. And that means that one of the other environmental elements that we need to take into account is also the cultural variables. And we have to tackle this because nowadays there is virtually little room for isolated works in organizations, especially in larger transnational corporations, when the same organization has to work in various countries in order to compete and succeed. And leadership traits that are required, for example, in one company or in one country might be different from those that are in another country or another branch of the company in the other countries. So whereas some cultures prefer autocratic leaders, or there are some other cultures that expect participative leaders, which is something that we have covered when we discussed Hofstede's work last lecture. For example, there are certain cultures, usually the Scandinavian cultures are the ones that want leaders to be participative and have a very low level of power distance, whereas countries that have a lot of power distance, for example, Chinese culture, they tend to prefer to have autocratic leaders, ones that tell people what to do and have little say in the decision-making process. So again, a leader might be a factor of cultural elements just as much as the other parts of the organizational elements. And finally, we go and discuss the integrative leadership theory paradigm. And when we talk about this theory paradigm, basically we are talking about something that has been developed in late 70s, early 80s. So we're talking about a paradigm that seeks to get together the entire concepts that have been discussed previously. So we tend to tie together these theories, and we usually tend to call this theory also the neo-charismatic theory in itself. So integrative leadership theories try to combine these traits, starting from the trait, behavior, and contingency theories in order to explain the relationship that exists between individuals or the leaders as well as the followers. So by understanding this, we tend to seek that this theory seeks to explain why, for example, some leaders work hard and sacrifice in order to achieve group and organizational goals, even if that might not be their own role as managers, for example. They still tend to go above and beyond their job description in order to reach group and organizational goals. So in its sense, it seeks to explain also the corporate citizenship or the citizenship behavior that we discussed in the past. And that is also something that can be explained by the motivating and influence power of leaders. Also, it tends to explain how effective leaders influence the situation of the followers and depending on the situation. So we tend to see whether there is some combination of born traits or learned behaviors and other situational factors that kind of better tend to explain how leadership works in practice. Great. So we can also work on various concepts when it comes to the way that how management there is a certain way of connecting leadership or this kind of paradigm towards management. So how management is now becoming a cornerstone when we are discussing, for example, leadership. We are talking about this paradigm shift between from management to leadership, and it is basically a shift from the older autocratic style to the newer participative style of leadership of management. And in these cases, usually we tend to claim that the focus of organizations should not only be to integrate on how to integrate management and leadership, but also to develop leadership skills of both managers and employees, since an organization tend to need both of these. So after the integrative leadership theory paradigm, we come together to the newest paradigm that is something currently in use, and that is when we are trying to overstate the importance of leadership above that of management as a role. That to say is not to stereotype that managers tend to have less impact if before than they do now that we are discussing about leadership. A manager can by all means be a proper leader to the company, but we are stating that management in itself is a position that has power based on a decree, so on a contract that he has signed, whereas a leader is something that comes from legitimacy of people, when people tend to follow said leader. Okay, great. So we take a short 10-minute break, and then we continue with the rest of the lecture, that is leadership traits and ethics. See ya in a bit. Okay, then let us get back to the lecture. So we are now going to shift the lecture towards the leadership traits and ethics. So basically, this is the second part of the lecture, and we will begin by talking about personality and traits. Again, you might see, as in the previous cases as well, we will be talking about topics that are similar to what we have discussed last week, but we are expanding on them from the leadership perspective. So when we're talking about traits, for example, we're talking about elements that are distinguishing characteristics of people. So a personal trait might be, as we said before, being shy, being outgoing, being loud, for example, being quiet, being warm or cold, aggressive, or being passive, for example. So when it comes to this, we have to understand that each individual is different and they possess traits that can be either advantageous or disadvantageous for certain job positions. For example, if we're talking about a shy person and a quiet person, for example, we usually tend to categorize these kind of traits into being an introvert. These people, if they seek a career, for example, as a person, we might already assume that they might not be very successful because the work environment, for example, for salespeople, requires people that are in constant contact with others and to be able to have certain outgoing characteristics or traits and the way that interpersonal skills as well. So whereas we can say that such a person, a quiet and a shy person, might be a great leader when it comes to projecting ideas, whereas they cannot be that successful when it comes, for example, to jobs that require direct contact with people, such as a salesperson in specificity. So the trait researchers usually have tended to look at traits or to examine traits when it comes to personality, to the way that a person looks, as we discussed earlier, to social and work-related characteristics as well. So when we try to come together to this, we tend to understand that personality is in fact a combination of these traits that we mentioned earlier, and usually personality is what we have when we want to classify an individual's behavior. So it is important and it is already understood that personality also influences our decision making, and it also affects how we perceive different action or people, or as well as our attitudes towards the others. So in this sense, we have already covered that personality is very important when it comes to making decisions or predicting our behavior within an organization. And we have already covered as well that when it comes to personality, it is something that is based both on genetics, so it is inherited from our parents and from our DNA that we have, as well as it is influenced also by the environment as well. So that being family, friends, school, as well as work. So that is probably some sort of personality defining characteristic that can be predicted. When people or expats, for example, or simple people just try to migrate to another country, they tend to have these personality clashes with the foreign culture, but eventually they will seek to assimilate and to get some personality traits that are consistent with the new culture that they are a part of. So in this sense, we claim that certain personality traits are surely inherited, but there are certain also environmental impact when it comes to defining these traits. So we are still revisiting again what we're talking about when we talked about the Big Five model of personality. And it is never enough to discuss upon this very useful and widely accepted scheme of defining personality. And we will see how this Big Five model, in fact, relates to various studies that have been conducted to understand what are these leadership traits, if we can claim or we can generalize enough to claim that certain traits of people are related to leadership potential as well as ethics. So the five-factor model of personality, or the Big Five, is a comprehensive and unifying framework for identifying these various or different personality dimensions. So as we have also mentioned in the previous lecture as well, it is the most widely accepted way to classify personalities, because it tends to overgeneralize, to hold true even when it is dealt with or tested throughout age or various age groups, sex, race, and language groups as well. So in this sense, we have to say that the purpose of the big five traits is to reliably categorize into one of these five dimensions that we have here, most, if not all, the traits that you would use to describe somebody else. So as you can see, in each of these dimensions that we have here, we might be having a various number of traits. And also, please know that, for example, when it comes to specific traits, we might be having them in various or in different names. For example, here we have surgency, whereas previously surgency in our previous lecture has been known as extraversion. So surgency and extraversion seems to be used interchangeably in this case, even though when we see the surgency might be a better case to explain this personality trait. Then also we have adjustment, which is a different category or a different name for what we have also already covered when we discussed the emotional stability. So emotional stability and adjustment seem to cover the same topic, but certain researchers tend to call it surgency and adjustment, whereas some others tend to call it extraversion and emotional stability. They pretty much cover the same thing. But just as a reminder, let's get back to it and understand what each of these in fact covered. So when we talk about the surgency or the extraversion, we tend to understand how one person is comfortable with a relationship, how a person deals with others or when he is in the presence of other people. Usually we have extroverts that tend to maintain a large number of relationships, so they have a big social group, whereas the opposite is true when it comes to introverts. They tend to usually be reserved and have fewer relationships. So people, now we come to the context of dominance that we discussed earlier. So when we talk about dominance here, we tend to think that people that are strong or they have strong results in surgency, they also tend to have this kind of personality traits that is related to dominance. These type of people are the ones that usually want to be in charge. So they thrive by being in a position to lead the others. And that is an important trait, because this type of people are natural leaders and they take the responsibility of leading very easily, so and enthusiastically. Whereas the opposite is true when it comes to introverts. There are certain people who simply do not want to lead other people. They just want to follow others and to deal with leaders. So not be the leaders themselves, but to deal with the leaders. So the main traits that are related to surgency or to extraversion is the dominance that we discussed, leadership, and extraversion traits are what complete this personality type or dimension. So when we talk about the agreeableness dimension, we're talking to a person's propensity to defer to others, how much we agree with others, or whether we have the propensity to contradict or to object what others think or they do. In this sense, when we talk about this, agreeable personality behavior is usually strong when a person is warm and caring by nature, is easygoing and tends to comply with the orders that one receives, is compassionate, is usually gentle, and is also sociable as well. So even if we tend to not credit For example, introverts or extroverts are usually credited with aggressiveness, and that is a trait that is leaded with leadership. Agreeableness, on the other hand, is a sociable. So these people are sociable, even though, as you can see, most of the traits that they express are softer in nature and might even belong to those, or we might assume or judge that they belong to people that share introvert traits as well. But these people tend to have a lot of friends as well and are very sociable because they are agreeable. They listen a lot. So people that are agreeable are usually those that are friendly, they are sociable, they try to get along with others uh, to the best of their abilities. And the other are the rebels, the ones that tend to not agree with people but tend to go by their own way. When we talk about conscientiousness, we talk about the dimension which helps people to reach goals, for example. It is, as we said in the previous lecture as well, it is something that uh, people try to express when they are very responsible, they are hardworking, and tend to have these conformist traits. So when we're talking about conformist traits, is something that is related to agreeableness, but this agreeableness only comes, or they conform only to how the organization currently is, and this agreeableness does not span when the organization seeks to change or to embrace change in general. So in this sense, we tend to say that people are conscientious only when they tend to do what they know well, and they tend to do that with a high level of enthusiasm and responsibility. So we ought to say that conscientiousness is also on a continuum between being responsible as well as dependable, as opposed to being irresponsible and undependable. So people with this trait are usually characterized as willing to work hard and put in extra time and effort to accomplish goals or to achieve success, be that company success or personal success. And this is also something that we have covered when we discussed organizational citizenship behavior as well. Then we get to this adjustment that we already said that when we talked about adjustment, we're talking about emotional stability, and it refers to a person's ability basically to withstand and to manage stressful environment. So when we talk about stress, when we talk about emotional stability, people that are high in this dimension usually tend to be cool. They have a cool head, they are calm, they are enthusiastic, but they are also secure in themselves. Whereas those on the other part of the spectrum, these people tend to be anxious, nervous, insecure, and in an attack mode. That something that we covered, and we said that these type of people are also caused as neurotic people as well. So at the adjustment, we include people that have emotional stability, they have self-control, they are good under pressure, as well as they have traits that are relaxed in nature. And then we have openness to experience, which is the last category of or dimension of traits of personality. And these are the people that usually are open to new ideas, and they are willing to change and try new things. So in this case, we're talking about people that tend to be the first to change the mentality and to try new things. Obviously, we tend to relate openness to experience to leadership potential as well. So as you can see, not only openness to experience, but most of these personality traits are in a way related to leadership as well. Due to, as a result of some research that has been made, a correlation has been found between the big five as well as leadership. And the correlation sought to be the highest as it pertains to the surgency or the extraversion personality trait. So basically, there has been a 0.31, so probably a 31% correlation between surgency and extroversion, or people that usually scored insurgency happen to also be to be successful leaders. Then we have a strong correlation also with conscientiousness, because in conscientiousness, 28% correlation has been found between people that scored high in this dimension and people that were considered successful leaders as well. And high correlation has also been found with openness to experience, as we said. So people that scored high tend to belong to the group of successful leaders as well. Whereas the agreeableness dimension seeks to have a very little correlation when it comes to successful leaders. So we tend to say that people should not be too concerned about whether they are liked too much by the others if they want to lead, because you can never satisfy everybody at the same time. So we cannot please everybody. In that sense, there is no strong correlation between agreeableness and successful leaders. It is only 0.08 or only 8%. Whereas when it comes to emotional stability or the adjustment that we have here, we tend to have that there exists a negative correlation of minus 0.24, so minus 24% correlation, which is negative. So we tend to say that, in other words, people that are high insurgency are perceived as leader-like. So that is the biggest correlation. They tend to like to work hard and they bring about change. That tends to lead to also correlate to consciousness and openness to experience. They are not too concerned about being well liked because they know that they cannot please everybody. That is, they are low on agreeableness, and they are stable and not overly emotional. So that includes the adjustment element as well. So as you can see, the Big Five tends to have some correlation to leadership or specific leadership traits, and we will tend to further discuss this in the following slides. But before we go there, we want to understand that even though there are certain positive traits that are interlinked when we talk about leaders, there are also certain derailed traits that are also parts of some managers that or leaders that tend to have gone off the path. And first of these, the real leadership traits, is bullying. So when we talk about bullying, we're talking about persons that tend to intimidate, is insensitive in nature and abrasive. So they tend to push their own ideas and be insensitive to any other remarks or ideas of their fellow workers. A person can also have a derailed leadership trait if a person is cold, is aloof, or is arrogant. These kind of people are usually the ones that are insensitive, or they just don't care, or they don't tend to not be very much personally involved with their fellows. They tend to keep an emotional distance as well as a distance of involvement when it comes to taking decision. They simply don't care that much about their fellow people. Then we have betrayed personal trust. So people, there might be some cases when some leader has, even though they have had or they have had the trust of their people due to some certain decision that they made or some activity that they have done, they have betrayed this personal trust and now they are untrustworthy. And this is some leadership traits that is very difficult to improve or to build upon. And another negative trait that a leader might possess or might develop over time is the self-centered leadership trait. And self-centered people are usually very ambitious and always think of the next job. So they tend to look at the big picture and not of the entire process of how to deliver the current job. This type of people usually tend to lead also to dissatisfied people, but also to the following derailed trait, that is when they face with specific performance problems. Because they are overambitious and always think of the next job, they tend to miss out on current issues that plague the company or the current job. So they have specific performance problems, and they usually this experience tends to stick with people and employees for a long time. And finally, they might also be overmanaged. And this is a type of person that tend to consolidate all the power and the management in their own hands, whereas they are unable to delegate or build teams. And usually, because of this, they seem to be a highly disconnected and demotivated people who will usually have subpar performance, which will lead to obviously other performance problem within an organization. So all of these traits tend to belong to this derailed leadership traits group. So traits that might not initially be a part of the personality of any leader, but they might develop over time if these people tend to overstate their role in the company and their own interests before that of the organization of fellow employees. But now that we've covered the negative part of the traits of the leaders, we go back to the traits that effective leaders tend to give or to express. And we start that these might be, for example, dominance, high energy, internal locus of control. They tend to have integrity, then flexibility. They are sensible to others, and they have the intelligence and emotional intelligence that we have discussed already. They are stable and they have self-confidence. We will talk about each of these traits in turn just in a bit. The first one that we are going to cover will be the dominance trait. So when we talk about the dominance trait, we tend to think that it affects all of the other traits that are related to effective leaders. So if a person does not want to be a leader, chances are that said person will not be a good leader. So basically, if a person does not have this dominant trait, so if the person does not naturally wants to be a leader, even if we push them into management positions, they will there is a high probability that these kind of people will lack the self-confidence and the drive or the energy to do the job properly. So in this sense, we tend to think that due to the pressure of the job and their undesirability to be in a leading position might also provide them an opportunity for them to be non-stable or sensitive to others because they are in a non-natural position according to their own personal traits. So as you can see, when we talk about dominance, and we tend to see where does this fit when it comes to the big five personality traits, we tend that dominance trait will fall under the dimension of extroversion. So a dominant person is a person that is highly extroverted, as opposed to introverted people who tend to wander away from the locus of control. Then another trait that we will be discussing is the high energy trait. So when we're talking about the high energy trait, or something that most effective leaders seem to have, it is something that leaders have high energy with a positive drive to work hard in order for them to achieve goals. So they have a never-ending level of energy to reach their own goals. So leaders usually are the ones that have enthusiasm and they don't give up, as they project usually a positive attitude to the others as well. Because of their energy and positivity, they tend to not be quitters and usually will project these positive attitudes to others. They are optimistic, enthusiastic, and positive, but not to the level. Sorry, but not to the level of being pushy to the others or obnoxious. They tend to deal with, but they usually don't accept setbacks. So they, even if they fail at first, they will try and get back at it again and find a new approach to save the issue that they initially took into their hands. So they are persistent people. So as you can see, high energy is something that most of us will also think when we talk about successful leaders. All of the leaders that we discussed initially tended to have high levels of energy, and high energy will fall within the big five dimensions under the dimension of consciousness. So people that have high energy are usually focused on doing or getting the job done, and they will not take no as an answer. Then another leadership trait that has been studied by researcher is the concept of self-confidence. And it is of no surprise that self-confidence is something that is required for all leaders to have. So it indicates whether you are self-assured in your judgments on decision-making, ideas, or your own capabilities. So leaders usually display self-assurance about their abilities, and by displaying this self-assurance, they also foster confidence from their followers because they are confident in themselves and they are sure in themselves. This will also be projected as confidence from the side of the followers as well. But by fostering confidence and gaining respect by followers, they are not arrogant because they know their limits and they do not claim to be know-it-alls. So this type of people are dependable and they tend to get the job done. But even though they are self-confident, they claim that they need other people to succeed, and usually are the ones that also listen to the others because they are confident that that will not also hinder or undermine their authority, but further to it will improve it. Other traits that we will cover are the locus of control, stability, and integrity. When we talk about the locus of control, we're talking about a continuum that exists between the external and internal belief of what controls a person's destiny. So we're still going into the spiritual aspect of the personality itself because it relates to who or what controls our own destiny. In the first, we have the externalizers who usually think that they have no control over their fate, that their fate is controlled by forces that are greater than them, or even agree that there is a certain spiritualism went to certain things. So if the date is the 13th, for example, of the month and it is a Friday, then it is an unlucky day. So no decision should be made on that day. Or some other cultures claim that one must not break a mirror because it means that bad luck will follow. The black cat crossing the road. All of these is that there is some other higher power that controls people's fate, and people that believe that others control their fate, they tend to have a lower performance level versus internalizers or people or groups of leaders, because internalizers are those that believe that they control their own fate, and their fate, or let's say the making things work, is something that falls under the locus of people themselves and not of other external forces. So obviously, people that take fate into their own hands are the ones that are called leaders, and they fall into the internalizers locus of control. The internalizers usually are also future oriented, and they set objectives and develop plans in order to accomplish them. So because they do not claim to think that things will be bestowed to them, they tend to plan for the future and are usually very self-confident and learn from their mistakes rather than blaming others or bad luck for mishappenings in their life. So as you can see, a locus of control is something very important because people that tend to take control of their own lives are the ones that make more successful leaders. And a locus of control in general as a trait is something that belongs to the big five dimension of openness to experience. Then we have stability. When we talk about stability, we obviously mean something in the lines of emotional stability itself. So as you might assume, it is also a part of the adjustment or emotional stability dimension of the Big Five. It is associated with manager effectiveness and advancement. But that means that it should be done through emotional control over feelings, a person that is focused on improving themselves and not blaming the others. So it has also been shown that effective leaders have a good understanding of their own weaknesses and strengths, and they are oriented towards improving themselves rather than simply defending their positions in face of failure or in the aftermath of the failure. And then we have also integrity as part of successful leaders' traits. And when we talk about integrity, we mean just as the word itself describes it, to behave in an honest, ethical, and trusting manner. So if a person or a leader has integrity, he is surely to be trustworthy. And a trustworthy person will surely get a lot of followers. It belongs also to the consciousness category in the Big Five, obviously, because such person tend to be direct and tend to face facts head on. So this type of people people with high integrity are the opposite of people that seek self-interest at the expense of the others. So it is about being honest, not using some diversive techniques such as lying, cheating, or stealing in order to reach their objectives. So if a leader that has been previously trusted, if they tend to deceive other people or their followers, they usually tend to lose on this integrity or trustworthiness, and that will be a major blow to their influence and legitimacy to follow or to lead other people. Another very important trait of effective leaders is also intelligence. And we have covered intelligence already, and we have talked about something that is related to emotional intelligence as well. And we have claimed that intelligence and emotional intelligence are not necessarily in the same domain, whereas intelligence is refers to the cognitive ability to think critically, to solve problems and make decisions. It is in the domain of general mental ability. So jobs usually in intelligent jobs that need intelligence are jobs that tend to have a lot of contact with others and issues to be dealt dynamically. So jobs that call for a high degree of intelligence and leaders typically leaders tend to have an above average intelligence uh, as opposed to regular employees or followers. And research suggests that we ought to move from conventional IQ or intelligence quotient that we are using to measure people's intelligence to something that tries to measure multiple intelligence, because now we understand that there are various degrees or levels of intelligence according to specific conditions. So what is important to us in the organizational behavior domain is the concept of emotional intelligence. And emotional intelligence, the basis of emotional intelligence is how people are able to work well with other people. So usually we claim that emotional intelligence tend to increase job performance, and usually EQ or emotional intelligence can outweigh even IQ when it comes to personal achievement. There are four components that we need to discuss in regard to the emotional intelligence and how it relates to the leaders, and that is that emotional intelligence, just like successful leaders, tend to have high levels of self-awareness. And by self-awareness, we mean that they are conscious of the emotions and how they affect their personal life. So in a sense, they are aware of themselves, their personality, and their emotions, and they can easily know how to use these emotions, to put these emotions to good use. Then there is the concept of social awareness. And when we're talking about social awareness, we are talking about the way that a person understands the feelings of the others, the emotions, the attitudes, and can predict behavior of the others. One of the most common attributes of socially aware people is the concept of empathy. For example, the empathy meaning the ability to put yourself in the shoes of the others, to put yourselves in the position of the others, so you can sense and feel their emotions and understand their point of view or their perspective. Then, on top of that, emotional intelligence also includes self-management. When we talk about self-management, we talk about the ability to control disruptive emotion. So by self-management, we build upon the self-awareness that we discussed above, because successful leaders not only know what are their emotions, but furthermore, they don't let these negative emotions, such as, for example, worry, anxiety, fear, anger, to interfere with getting things done or reaching the objectives that the leader has set themselves. And finally, uh, emotional intelligence also is related to relationship management. And relationship management relates to the ability to work well with the others, which is also dependent on the other three characteristics that we discussed above. So knowing themselves, self-awareness and self-management, as well as empathy or social awareness, are important elements when we want to build relationship. So successful leaders, in fact, try to build relations by communicating, responding to people's emotions, handling conflict, and influencing others in a positive and ethical way. On top of that, we also have traits that are related to flexibility and sensitivity to the others. As we can see, we are going through the exhaustive list of the traits that modern literature is attributing to leaders. So the last two that we will be discussing are the flexibility and the sensitivity towards the others. When we talk about flexibility, we are talking about the ability to adjust to different situations. So obviously, when we talk about the big five dimensions, flexibility will fall under the openness to experience category. So it is the ability to adjust and adapt to different situations, and they are usually the first that are thought upon when we tend to lead change into an organization, because they are the ones that usually take proactive measures and come up with new ideas or with new opportunities. So effective leaders are flexible and simply can be beneficial into change situations, which is pretty much every day in our dynamic uh, landscapes. Then we have sensitivity to others. When we talk about the sensitivity to others, we're talking about the way that we are understanding others. So group members in general, either as individuals or as groups. And we tend to see everybody's position on the issue, how we can communicate and how we can influence them. As you can see, when we talk about this sensitivity, we're talking about the way that we agree with others and how we accept that people agree or disagree with us. So in itself, lack of to be sensitive is in itself the to be emotionally intelligent. So sensitivity to the others and emotional intelligence are something that share a lot of common ground. And lack of sensitivity in part is part of the reason that there is some executive derailment, or we have those negative traits or attributes that we discussed earlier. It's because people basically tend to see themselves and their own interests before those of the organization or to the other employees or their followers. So in this case, we ought to understand that the opposite is also true. That's why sensitivity is very important when we are trying to solve conflicts, or even when we are trying to represent the organization or our team or our individual views in a negotiation role. Because being sensitive and listening to others will usually provide beneficial results or a win-win situation as per the negotiations, optimal resolutions. Now, after understanding these trails that are generalized, but we ought again to say that they are not universal, but the traits that tend to describe leaders in general, we tend to go and understand the way that the achievement motivation theory work, as well as the leader motive profile theory work. We're talking about two theories that share common ground. And these two theories try to explain and predict behavior and performance based on one's need for achievement, power, and affiliation. So basically, when it comes to McClelland trait theories or the achievement motivation theory, we the author originally thought that or believed that people have needs, and usually the needs are those that motivate us to behave in a certain way in order to satisfy these needs. So our behavior is motivated by needs, and this is a process that is unconscious. So we are motivated by needs, our behavior is motivated by them, and we do that in an unconscious way. For example, you ought to think that our needs have changed when it comes to how we live today as opposed to how we have lived, for example, 20 years above. And we know that there is a lot that we can attribute to technology, communication technology, as well as consumerism that tells us how we want, for example, how we buy products, how we buy consumer products in general. So need for achievement, owning a big house is usually fulfilling our sense of achievement, even though it does not do much, for example, functionally if we are a small family unit, or if we, for example, buy a certain product that holds emotional value or emotional brand value, that means we are loyal to that specific brand that fulfills our need for affiliation, for example. So this sense is something that has been studied by McClelland, and he mentioned that there are usually, even the needs vary, we can usually generalize people's needs as the need for achievement, need for power, and need for affiliation. And we are talking about the higher needs, obviously. High energy, yes. Mohammed asks whether high energy should be correlated to one of the big five. Sorry that I missed that earlier. So when we talk about high energy obviously is something that is related to the big five, and it is something that is related to the consciousness. So high energy people are those that usually tend to get the job done. So they are the people that take no for an answer, and they usually try until they succeed. So getting back to our needs, or the way that needs form or shape our behavior and the traits of leaders themselves, we tend to say that there are usually three categories of needs. We have the need for achievement, we have the need for power, and we have the need for affiliation as well. So when we talk about the needs for achievement, for example, we're talking about how people are concerned for excellence in accomplishment through individual efforts, for example. So people that are usually that have a strong need for achievement are people that have usually an internal locus of control. So people that tend to think that they have control over their own fate, whereas people that have a low need for achievement are those that believe on the focus or on the role of external factors and their influence on their own life. So they accept locus of control. These people are usually very self-confident, and they have high energy traits as well. They are goal-oriented and usually set moderate but realistic and attainable goals, because by doing so, they they fulfill their sense of achievement. These type of people usually take calculated risk, but they are achievers, so they do not back down from a certain challenge that arises. Then there is a certain group of people that have the need for power. The need for power is the unconscious concern for influencing others and seeking positions of authority. And obviously, this category of people will fall under the extroversion or surgency big five dimension as well, whereas the need for achievement would fall, for example, under the conscientiousness dimension. So people that have a strong need for power, for example, they tend to have dominating traits. And these dominating traits also are related to their high uh, level of self-confidence as well as high energy traits. So they are usually goal-oriented, and they are very ambitious, and they don't need to be affiliated. They want to lead others, but they don't have a big urge to be part of groups or to be accepted by groups. They want to lead others. So they are more concerned about getting their own way or influencing others rather than finding out what other people think of them, which is probably the opposite of what people expect when they belong to the group of the people that need affiliation. So the need for affiliation as a people's need is the unconscious concern for developing, maintaining, and restoring a close personal relationship with the others. People that have a strong need for affiliation are usually those that have they are sensitive to the others and are characterized as seeking close relationship and maintaining these. So they are more interested, or they are more concerned of what others think of them rather than getting their own way or moving their own agenda forward. These people are more of people's people rather than those that are in power that seek getting their own way, just leading and influencing others. Now, when we already know these three needs, the need for achievement, need for power, and need for affiliation, we can go on and create some form of theory to understand whether there is or there is not a leader motive profile. So leader's motive profile is basically an attempt to explain and predict leadership success based on a person's need for achievement, power, and affiliation. And notice that we have not included in this classification any dimension that is related to emotional stability and openness to experience when it comes to the big five, because these dimensions are not in fact needs. They are states of mind or states of personality, but they are not individual needs. So we already sought to discuss how needs can predict behavior or motivate people to act. So when it comes to the big five, and the need for achievement, power, and affiliation do not include emotional stability and openness to experience. So now the closest we can get to creating this leadership motive profile is the LMP itself. So when we talk about the LMP includes or the ideal leader is the one who has a high need for power, but this power is socialized. That is greater than the need for affiliation and with a moderate need for achievement. So a person that is that has all of the all of the needs, but the need for power is high, but the need for power is socialized power. And the person that has also more need for power rather than for affiliation and a moderate need for achievement is considered to be a uh, uh, idealistic leader profile. So first of all, let's go with the power. What is power? Power is very important to leaders because they use power to influence their followers, peers, as well as higher tier managers. So without power, we can clearly say that there is no leadership. In order to be successful, leaders need to be in charge and to enjoy the leadership role that they have. But there is something that we ought to take into consideration as well, and that is the concept of socialized power. So when we talk about socialized power, we ought to think initially that power can neither be good or bad. So people can use power for their own uses or own interest, or they can use the power to do good. So the power in itself is neutral. You might recall probably the similarity to the Star Wars movies. So there is force, so there is the positive side or the dark side of the force and the light side of the force. It is the same thing when we tend to discuss power in a real life situation. So power can be used to help oneself, or it can be used to help others, or it can be used to help everybody uh, in at the same time. So if it is used for personal gain, it is called personalized power. But if it is used to help yourself and the others, it is called socialized power. So we tend to think that a leader should have power and should enjoy leading others, but they should express socialized power uh, behavior rather than individualized or personalized power. Then a leader, when it comes to achievement, an effective leader has a moderate need for achievement. They don't want to overachieve because that makes them egoistic and probably too self-absorbed. But they so they in this case they are enthusiastic enough to achieve to reach the goals, but without doing so for individual purposes. So when it comes to achievement, people with a high need for achievement usually tend to lean towards personal achievement as well. So they are not interested, when they are not interested in being a leader, there is a chance to kind of move from the common goals towards personalized objectives. And when it comes to affiliation, we said that usually people need to have more need of power than need for affiliation if a person ought to be a good or an effective leader. So when it comes to affiliation, leaders with high need for affiliation usually tend to have a lower need for power, and they are reluctant to play the bad guy role, such as, for example, disciplining others if they did something wrong, or they usually are more reluctant to change because they don't want to disturb the status quo or the status of established and functioning relationship with people. So if we tend to have a lower need for affiliation, that means that we are ready to take on the job of moving forward, embracing change, and probably thinking on what should be done rather than what people think of us. Then we get to the leadership attitudes. And it is something that we will not be focusing that much today because it is something that we have already covered. We're talking about theory X and theory Y and the Pygmalion effect as well. So as we said, both theories, theory X and theory Y, they tend to explain and predict leadership behavior and performance based on the leader's attitude about followers. So the main paradigm is how we see people. So basically, job attitudes and performance are something that are related to the way that the leader or the manager sees people. For example, let's look at these two sentences and see how we think. The first one is that people enjoy working and will do a good job without being closely supervised. That means independence is key to being successful. Whereas the second category of people will think that people do not like work in general, and they will not do a good job unless they are closely supervised and punished or rewarded. So these two people, in fact, project the idea behind both theory X and theory Y. So theory X obviously hold the idea that employees dislike work. So theory X is based that people generally are demotivated and they work because they have to, whereas theory Y is that people find purpose in what they do, and usually they like to work and do the job well, even if they are even if they are not properly supervised. So to see the differences, or to recap on the differences, is that managers with theory X attitudes tend to have usually a negative, pessimistic view of employee. They usually are more coercive, they are autocratic, they seek to control and supervise people. They tend to have more pessimistic view on the work and the expectations of their employees, and they use threats and punishments to move forward or get things done. Whereas theory Y is the direct opposite of what we said here. These people tend to have a positive and optimistic view of employees and job processes. They tend to have participative decision making and seek the support of others, and they are usually more inclined to have interpersonal leadership style and will seek motivation and rewards as basis for increasing performance. So they are completely negative, and usually there is now when we mentioned about the paradigm shift from management to leadership earlier on, we were meaning also the paradigm shift from theory X to theory Y, from the industrialized mentality of leadership or organization to the dynamic people development or people management skills that exist in the theory Y concept. Also, when we talked about the Pygmalion effect, it is something that leads to how people or how managers' attitude, what they expect, and how people or how employees respond to the expectations. If you treat people like they are stars or they are good, they will usually be good for you, and usually it is a trait that can be improved. So basically, if you expect that a student of yours will perform great in mathematics so as to be an astronaut, that means that that person will tend to reach, or in a sense, they will try to reach the level that you think of them. And basically, it is a study that has been made in order to support this concept is in a study that was made for welding students, so physical workers who weld metals. The foreman who was training the group was given the name of certain students that were quite intelligent and is expected of them to be well. So even though the foreman doesn't know this, the name of the students that he received is just random names. So basically, there was no difference between the students, but he was given random names. The only difference that exists in reality is what foreman expected of them. The so-called intelligent students did significantly better than the other group members. And this tells everything about it. The teacher's expectations influence the behavior and performance of the students. So because the teacher or the foreman in this case expected that these people will behave better, probably expressed or was expressed in higher achievement from these people as well. And this is what is called the Pygmalion effect. And in this sense, there are two kinds of leaders. So we have those leaders that are optimists and tend to lift others up, and we have those people or those leaders that tend to pull everybody down. So it is imperative in this sense that we belong to the group that tend to lift others up, and probably to ask a little bit more than what we currently are giving. Because in this case, we are setting a higher standard. And in Lou Holt's words, he said that the worst disservice that you can do as a coach, as a teacher, or as a parent, or as a leader is to say to your followers that I don't think you are capable of doing very much. So I'm going to lower the standard. If you lower the standard by prejudicing that your followers are not capable of reaching that standard, that will make them think that they are underachievers, and they will in fact fulfill your prophecy of being low achievers themselves. So in order to project this optimism and to lift others up, a person or a leader has to have this self-concept. And when we're talking about self-concepts, we're talking about the way that leaders see themselves. It refers to the positive or negative attitudes that people have about themselves. And self-efficacy in itself also is just a small uh, addition to the self-concept, because self-efficacy is a belief that you can perform well in a specific situation. Though this is very important because they are related to the self-confidence, and self-confidence is something that is needed when it comes to leading and projecting confidence to others and gaining their legitimacy. Because there is much truth when we say the following proverb: if you think you can, quote, I'm sorry, if you think you can, you can. If you think you can't, you cannot. So if you don't believe that you can be a successful leader, in fact, you probably will not be so. And are there any ways that we can, in fact, improve this positive attitude and this concept of self-concept? And as it turns out, there is something that can be done. So positive attitude, self-concept that is related to self-confidence as well, is a certain trait that can be improved if we take into consideration these 12 advices, so to say. Initially, we should try to consciously have and maintain a positive and optimistic attitude. And if you don't have, for example, a positive attitude, it may be because of your unconscious thought or behavior. So only with conscious effort, you can improve your self-concept. You ought to also realize that there are few, if any, benefits to negative, pessimistic attitudes about others and yourself. Think about it. When was the last time that holding a grudge, worrying, or being angry has ever helped to solve an issue? Instead of that, try to cultivate optimistic thoughts. By doing so, by using positive talk, so by praising yourself for the good things that you have done, and using mental imagery, so projecting yourself or seeing yourself as succeeded, that will help you to create the positive attitudes and self-concept as well. And also, if you catch yourself complaining or being negative in any way, stop and change to positive attitude. This requires emotional intelligence, requires you having self-awareness and control over your emotions. But it is something that can be trained if we tend to think rationally. But the best way to not fall into negative thinking is by avoiding negative people, especially those that make you feel negative about yourself or belittle yourself. Associate with people that have a positive self-concept, and they will feed your self-concept as well. Set and achieve goals. It doesn't mean to have ideals or long reaching goals. By making daily, weekly, or monthly goals and reaching them, they will help us create a sense of accomplishment, and in a sense they will improve our self-worth or the way that we see ourselves. Then we have also focusing on on your success, and not dwelling on the failure. By focusing on the success, we tend to improve our confidence in our own abilities, but that does not mean that we should forget failure. Failure is a great teacher, and the experience that we get from failure can be used to build upon further success. We ought to accept compliments and not just say that everybody could have done that, because accepting compliments might actually helps us to develop our self-concept. And try to not belittle the accomplishment or compare yourself to others, because no matter how good you are there in this big world, throughout the 7 billion people that are there, there is certainly somebody that is better than you in a certain way. So trying to compare yourself to others is never a good idea. Be satisfied with what you have brought forth. Think for yourself and be a positive role model is to not not to be influenced by people, especially negative people, but on the other hand, to try to be a positive role models to the others. And finally, it might help also that when you are feeling bad and things are going wrong, try to do something to help somebody which is in a position that is worse off than you. In that sense, you will see that you don't have it so bad, and you will realize that the more you give, the more you get. Volunteering is a way to go in this sense. So if we try to put together all what we discussed above, we can create this sort of leadership style matrix when we try to project the positive aspects of theory Y with the positive aspects of self-concept and the way that the theory X projects on both positive and negative self-concept. So basically, having a positive self-concept and exhibiting theory Y attitudes is the best scenario for building leadership potential. So these kind of people tend to give and accept positive feedback. They expect others to succeed, and they let others to do their job their way. So these are the social leaders, so the best type of leader according to leadership traits that we have discussed and the theories that we have covered so far. Whereas the worst part would be the theory X attitude leader that has negative self-concept. These kind of people tend to be very pessimistic and they promote hopelessness. So basically, these type of people tend to withdraw, or they have withdrawal behavior, and people tend to resort to delinquency and to destructive workplace behavior if they are led by these type of people. And finally, when it comes to ethics, we are discussing about the standards of what is right and what is wrong, and how this concept of right and wrong can influence our behavior. So business ethics and ethics codes usually help us to constrain everyday business conduct, and as well as on the more larger scene, we have the laws and regulations that prevent unethical behavior. We tend to learn from mistakes, and that means that we tend to learn from such scandals such as World.com bankruptcy, Enron, and Arthur Andersen, which has actually led to creating a new law, or the Act of Sarbanes-Oxley of 2006, that will help people to better predict, or to better blow the whistle on unethical behavior. These kind of examples, World.com and Enron, are probably the most prominent ones, but they are not the only ones. When we talk about ethical behavior, we ought to think that ethical behavior relates even to individual traits and to people that deal with various degrees of issues or different levels of management. Ethical behavior relates to individual traits in such ways as it deals with urgency, consciousness, agreeableness, and self-concept. So, but not only that, because when we tend to think about the way that leadership can, or ethical behavior can develop moral development, we tend to think about the way that moral development refers to understanding what is right from wrong and choosing to do the right thing. Because usually people tend to know what the right thing is, but usually tend even to choose to wander off. There are three levels of personal moral development. We have the post-conventional one, when the behavior is motivated by the universal principles of what is right and wrong. So we might say that we don't lie to customers because it is simply wrong to lie to them. That is when we are looking at the general preconceptions of right and wrong. Then we have the conventional moral development that usually lives up to the expectations of society. I lie to customers because the other people do as well. So it is expected of us. It is not something out of the ordinary. And we have the pre-conventional moral grounds. That means self-interest motivate our behavior. I lie to customers because I want to sell more and get a higher bonus. So these are three levels of moral development that tend to influence our decision making. Usually, ethical behavior is prone to situational factors. So if we tend to create a very competitive and very stressful job environment, such as was the case with example with Enron, we tend to force people to go into unethical behavior if we force them to reach goals at any cost. Even the lack of policies, codes of ethics, or punishments to this, if the breach of these codes is done, usually leads to increase the odds of unethical behavior. But how people justify unethical behavior? Moral justification is basically the process when people try to reinterpret immoral behavior in terms of a higher purpose. We usually tend to rationalize if we do something wrong with statements like everybody does it or I deserve it. For people, few people in fact see themselves as doing something unethical. And the most commonly used justifications to unethical behavior would be, for example, when people try to displace responsibility. They would say that I was only following my orders. My boss told me to inflate the figures. So even though we knew that we are doing an unethical behavior, we tend to think that it can be justified because it was not our order, it was the order of the boss. So they try to displace the responsibility, or they try to diffuse the responsibility. We all take bribes. It's the way that we do business. Probably this is something that led Enron, for example, to fail. We have the advantageous comparison. Another way to justify an ethical behavior. We pollute less than our competitors. So we know that we are still doing a bad thing because we are polluting, because we are doing less than the others. We tend to claim that what we are doing is legal. We disregard, ethical. Disregard or distortion of consequence. So we try to disregard the consequences of our actions. So if I inflate the figures, for example, no one will be hurt, and I won't get caught. Even if I do, I'll just get a warning. So it's no big deal. So in this sense, we tend to do things because we will not get caught, or we try to attribute the blame. So it's my coworker's, for example, fault that I hit him and put him in this hospital. He said he insulted me, so I had to hit him. So basically, even though we are the ones, the aggressors, we tend to blame the others for our actions. And lastly, we might also have the euphemistic labeling, which means that we tend to use more softer words in order to cover the deed. For example, terrorist group sounds bad, but if we say freedom fighters, they sound more justifiable. So in all of these cases, we see that people tend to always see themselves as moral or holding moral grounds. Even if they tend to step over these moral grounds, they tend to have justifications because people never see themselves as not being moral. So being an ethical leader, in fact, requires courage. As you can see, we have to usually go above and beyond to do the right thing at the risk of being rejected or even losing legitimacy or respect. So the guide to find courage to do the right thing is basically if we try to focus on a higher purpose. So when we look out for the well-being of customers as well as employees, rather than just the objectives of the company, when we draw strength from the others, and we seek the support of friends, family, and colleagues, when we take risk without fear of failure and accept that failure is already a part of life and we have to embrace it, and usually failure is the one that leads to success. And finally, when we use the frustration and anger for good. So if you feel frustrated at some unmoral or unethical behavior, you can always be a whistleblower to the unethical behavior, and that will help you to lead an ethical as well as a leader, as a positive leader style. So basically, it's as simple as following the golden rule. That is, do unto others as you want them to do unto you. And this is what it means to be a leader, though we have so far understood that everybody can be a leader, although there are certain traits that people are born into. Not everything is hereditary. So there are certain traits that can make each of us a leader. So no matter if we are extroverted or introverted, if we are shy or if we are outgoing, we might find ourselves in various leadership positions if we tend to follow course and if we have the desire to be in a leadership position. So this is what as regarding to this lecture. If you have any question, please ask now. Otherwise, I thank you all for your time, and we'll see each other next week. Thank you and goodbye.